I went to a housewarming party last weekend for a couple of old friends. Let's just call them Mark and Sarah. And on paper, I mean, they are the evolutionary jackpot. You've got dual six-figure incomes, a really stable relationship, a sprawling new home in a safe neighborhood. You look at them and you just think, if anyone could afford to restart the population, it's these two. But then, when the subject of children, inevitably came up, the whole atmosphere in the room, it stiffened instantly. And Mark didn't just say no. He actually pulled out his phone and started citing data. Like, with the intensity of a forensic accountant, he referenced a Brookings Institution analysis that shows it costs exactly $318,949 to raise a child to age 17, and that's excluding college tuition. He brought up daycare costs in cities like Boston ending $23,000 a year, and he was, shaking his head as he described this educational arms race that's required just to give a kid a fighting chance. To him, a child wasn't a legacy; it was a bankruptcy risk. He looked genuinely stressed out, just completely convinced that despite all their wealth, the system had priced them out of parenthood. But then the scene just shifted dramatically. A timer dinged in the kitchen, and Sarah's face lit up with this warmth I hadn't seen all night long. She rushed over to prepare dinner, not for us, but for their golden doodle, Barnaby. And I watched as they spent the next 20 minutes just fussing over this dog, feeding him premium organic food, cooing at him with this specific pitch of voice that brain imaging studies actually show. It activates the exact same maternal regions as looking at a human infant. That contradiction, it left me stunned. I mean, here were two people rationally explaining why they couldn't afford the investment of a child, while at the same time pouring all their resources and affection into a creature that offers zero genetic return. It wasn't that they lacked the desire to nurture, it was that their ancient wiring had been completely, utterly short-circuited. They're part of this seismic shift that's driving South Korea's fertility rate to 0.76 and Italy's to 1.13. Not because they're selfish, but because they are victims of a biological hack. Standing there, watching them parent a dog, I realized we aren't looking at an economic crisis. We're looking at a case of mistaken identity inside the human brain. And that story, which is really becoming the defining paradox of developed nations, that's the focus of our deep dive today. How can the wealthiest, healthiest societies in all of human history suddenly refuse to reproduce? Citing costs. We're going to look past the spreadsheets and ask, is this collapse of fertility, is it truly an economic crisis, or is it a profound biological and cognitive hack?
Oh, it's absolutely a hack. And, that requires us to change the entire way we frame the problem. The core question is why the human brain, which is the product of millions of years of optimization for survival and reproduction, has started treating reproduction like an optional high-risk activity that conflicts with their life path.
Right. It's like a bug in the software.
Exactly. And to understand it, we have to frame the discussion around two really foundational evolutionary concepts that explain this bizarre disconnect between resources and, reproductive output. The first one is evolutionary mismatch, or adaptive lag.
Okay.
And this basically posits that our deep inherited psychological mechanisms, you could call it the software of the human mind, they evolved to solve problems that were specific to the environment of our ancestors. That's the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, or EEA, which, define 99% of human history.
Yeah.
The problem is the modern context has just changed so rapidly that this ancient programming, it simply doesn't produce adaptive outputs anymore.
So it's running perfectly, but on the wrong operating system.
It's running perfectly, but the world has changed too much. So we're essentially taking this ancient navigation equipment and trying to use it on a hyperspace jump. The equipment itself works, but the environment is just unrecognizable, and that leads to, catastrophic results.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And the second concept that really drives the failure is what we call supernormal stimuli and bias exploitation. Our evolved wiring has these built-in biases mechanisms that are designed to pay attention to certain features, like preferring things that are bigger or brighter or sweeter, because those attributes historically signaled greater value.
Okay, so a shortcut that used to work.
It was a very reliable shortcut. But modern culture excels at creating inputs, what we call superstimuli, that are exaggerated, predictable, and artificial. And they effectively hijack those ancient reward and nurturing systems.
Which brings us right back to Barnaby the Golden Doodle.
Yes.
The brain is getting a perfect low-cost substitute for the difficult, high-cost investment of a human child.
Exactly. These modern inputs, they redirect our limited energy, our time, our resources away from the difficult, unpredictable work of biological reproduction. And they point it towards easier, more predictable, and often more intense forms of immediate gratification.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission today is to figure out why these psychological mechanisms that govern parental investment are being short-circuited. We need to investigate the deep-seated pressures, the economic fears that Mark cited, and the cognitive rerouting, the nurturing energy being funneled into Barnaby, to understand how the brain's ancient parental investment calculator is, well, triggering an abort mission on raising large families. And that leads directly to those critically low fertility rates we see in developed societies. So let's start with the cornerstone. Evolutionary mismatch. We know the environment changed too fast, causing this adaptive lag. But can you define what that lag looks like from a psychological perspective? When does a mechanism designed to help us suddenly start hurting us?
Well, the mismatch occurs when a psychological mechanism produces an output that is maladaptive in the modern environment. The key insight, and this is really important, is that the mechanism isn't broken. It's still following its original evolved decision rule.
Okay, so the logic is sound, but the context is all wrong.
Precisely. Natural selection shapes our psychological adaptations to take specific environmental cues as input and then produce adaptive behaviors as output. Historically, these behaviors increase survival or reproductive prospects. But because the environment changed so rapidly, way faster than genetic adaptation can occur, the input cues are just fundamentally different now. And the resulting behavior is, well, it's detrimental to fitness.
So the mechanism works perfectly, but the data flowing into it is corrupted. It makes sense why we need to understand the ancestral rules first.
Yes, and we can illustrate this with probably the simplest example, food preference. In the ancestral world, the evolved rule was simple: prefer and seek out the sweetest tasting things, and this was profoundly beneficial.
Right, because sweet meant calories, ripe fruit, honey.
Exactly. Ripe fruit, wild yams, honey. It was rare, calorically dense, and nutrient-rich. The resulting output consumption was adaptive.
But the input for sweetness has changed drastically in the modern world.
Oh, radically. The modern mismatch happens because the sweetest tastes now come from readily available manufactured foods just packed with refined sugars. The mechanism is still following the ancestral rule: prefer the sweetest taste. But the resulting behavior consuming vast quantities of processed sugar over and over is maladaptive.
Because our bodies can't handle it.
Our physiological systems, like the complex regulatory systems for insulin and glucagon, they just didn't evolve to handle such unnaturally high concentrated sugar loads. And that leads to systemic failures like type 2 diabetes. The brain is getting a high-value signal for something that is actually low value or even harmful in the long run.
That's a perfect contrast. Now let's apply that logic to the environment of evolutionary adaptiveness, the EEA. What are the most radical differences between those small, kin-based groups where our psychology was forged and the world Mark and Sarah navigate today?
The divergence is, it's almost unimaginable to the ancient brain. If you just look at population density alone, modern cities can have densities up to 100,000 times larger than the average ancestral group.
100,000 times. Wow.
So an ancient mechanism that was designed to assess competition for resources would look at a modern city and interpret it as a state of extreme, overwhelming scarcity, regardless of how many supermarkets there are.
So the brain is screaming famine in the middle of a land of plenty.
In a sense, yes. This hyperdensity likely signals to ancient mechanisms that resources are critically limited and competition is just absolutely fierce. So the psychological mechanism says, there are too many competitors, slow down reproduction.
I see.
And then on top of that, you have the radical shift in social support. Our psychological mechanisms evolved when we lived in these tight-knit, kin-based groups where the burden of childcare was distributed among many related adults. It's a phenomenon called alloparenting.
The it takes a village idea.
Literally. But today, we have a much greater geographical dispersal of families. This lack of critical, immediate kin support is hypothesized to contribute to everything from difficulty in raising children to increasing rates of things like postpartum depression in new mothers. The brain is basically signaling insufficient support network to guarantee offspring survival.
Okay, and what about the digital world?
Well, we are constantly exposed to digital superstimuli. Think about the proliferation of attractive individuals you encounter electronically, actors, models, influencers, that just flood our visual field every single day. This input affects mechanisms designed to calibrate relationship commitment and mate selection. If your brain is constantly being shown these idealized, unattainable mates, it can destabilize your current relationship and foster a sense of perpetual self-dissatisfaction.
Making the decision to invest in a family seem less appealing, or I guess less stable. So it sounds like the modern world is just an endless stream of bad data, telling our ancient brain we are too poor, too unsupported, and our partner isn't attractive enough, all while we're living in what is, objectively, material comfort.
That summarizes the mismatch perfectly. And within this framework, we can specifically identify two ways the mismatch can occur: forced and hijacked.
My initial thought was that low fertility was forced, because the economic costs are so high. So why is it categorized primarily as a hijack?
That's a great question. So a forced mismatch occurs when a new environment is imposed and the psychological mechanism is forced to respond, often leading to a physical pathology. So for example, our mechanisms for eye development, they evolved when we were constantly scanning dynamic, moving stimuli in the distance.
Looking for predators or prey?
Right. But today, we force our eyes to focus almost exclusively on close-up, static stimuli screens, books, phones during critical developmental periods. The eye development mechanism produces a perfectly adaptive outcome for that close-up, fixed environment, myopia or nearsightedness. It's a forced, maladaptive response.
Okay, I get it. The system adapted to the new, weird input.
But the low fertility problem, it fits much better into the category of hijacked mismatch. This is where a novel stimulus is so intense or so predictable that it is actively favored by a mechanism over the natural stimulus it evolved to process. The decision rule for fertility, which involves calculating the optimal investment needed for future success in reproduction, is being actively exploited by inputs that are unnaturally intense or predictable.
So we're not just dealing with the environment changing and leaving us behind. We're dealing with an environment that has manufactured a perfect substitute, something that's luring our brains away from the evolutionary imperative of having children.
Precisely. Novel or fake cues with similar attributes successfully replace the original high-cost input. This is the core of the biological hack. The brain finds an easier, cheaper way to satisfy deep-seated needs for mastery and nurturing, and those behaviors are non-reproductive. If a high population density signals competition, that might trigger a slow life history strategy, a delay in reproduction, which itself is still an evolved mechanism. But the hijack makes the alternative path, the path away from children, so powerfully attractive through supernormal rewards that the brain chooses to funnel all its energy there.
And this shift of energy, this active luring away from reproduction, that's exactly what we saw playing out between Mark, Sarah, and Barnaby. The dog became the perfect low-risk supernormal stimulus for nurturing. Where does this concept even come from, and why is the human brain so susceptible to it?
Well, the concept originated back in the 1940s with the ethologist Nicholas Tinbergen. He was studying animal behavior, and he defined a supernormal stimulus as an artificial stimulus that is exaggerated compared to the naturally occurring key stimulus, and it causes the animal to trigger an exaggerated response. The animal is effectively fooled because the artificial stimulus just hits the instinctual button harder than the real thing.
So it's like finding the hidden max dopamine button in the brain's programming.
Exactly. His classic experiments showed this bias exploitation perfectly. Tinbergen created these artificial bird eggs that were larger and had more exaggerated speckling and color than the real eggs laid by the mother bird.
And the mother bird fell for it.
Completely. The mother birds were so overwhelmingly drawn to the exaggerated artificial eggs that they would roll them into the nest and choose to sit on them, sometimes abandoning their own eggs entirely. The simple evolved rule, choose the biggest, most colorful egg to maximize return, was exploited.
That's incredible.
And similarly, artificial stickleback fish models with exaggerated red bellies would trigger more aggressive courtship rituals from male sticklebacks than actual females would. The bias is simple. Bigger, brighter, more intense equals better or more valuable, even when it's biologically useless.
That brings immediate clarity to the claims that humans are masters at creating these pleasure technologies that actively hurt our reproductive fitness.
Yes. When we apply the superstimulus concept to human behavior, we see how modern inventions are just designed to exploit our core reward systems. Think about the cuckoo chick example. It evolved to have a huge, brightly colored gape and a loud, aggressive begging call that completely overrides the host mother bird's natural instincts, ensuring it gets fed over the host's own brood. That chick is a biological superstimulus.
So culturally, we're designing our own cuckoo chicks.
We're designing superstimuli that compete with the human infant for resources.
And the engine driving all this, the central operating system of pleasure, is the human reward system, which is largely managed by dopamine. How does this compulsion loop work to reroute our behavior?
We're talking about the dopamine reward loop, which creates these habitual chains of activity. And it's important to know dopamine isn't just about pleasure. It's the molecule of motivation and anticipation.
Okay, so it's the wanting, not just the having.
Exactly. The cycle is critical to understand because it's where energy gets rerouted. It has three parts. First, the anticipation of reward. This is the key phase where dopamine is created and released, driving the seeking behavior. Second, there is the activity itself, the effort, like searching or clicking or grinding in a game. And third, there is obtaining the reward, which causes another pulse of dopamine and reinforces the entire cycle, making it more likely we repeat the activity.
And what makes this modern digital reward system so much more compelling than the, unpredictable high-stakes system of raising children?
The crucial element is the variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. It's a psychological principle where the rewards are unpredictable and intermittent. If a response only has a chance of producing a reward, it causes the brain to produce dopamine at much higher, more sustained rates than if the reward were fixed or predictable. This is the mechanism that drives addiction.
Because the brain is highly motivated by the potential reward.
Right. It makes perfect sense. It's the difference between knowing you will get a cookie at 3 p.m. that's a fixed schedule versus checking the pantry constantly because there might be a cookie there. That's a variable schedule.
That's a great analogy.
And think about your email inbox or a social media feed. You don't know if the next refresh will bring a valuable work notification, a personal message, or a meaningless ad. The brain is constantly running in anticipation mode, keeping the dopamine high. The reward is cheap, quick, and intermittent, which makes it incredibly habit-forming.
And this variable schedule is almost entirely absent from the act of raising a child, which is a fixed, massive, 20-year commitment of unpredictable difficulty with the payoff decades away.
Precisely. And this is why we return to the dog nurturing paradox. Barnaby, the golden doodle, is a super stimulus for the nurturing drive. Brain imaging studies have confirmed that looking at a dog, petting it, cooing at it, it activates the exact same maternal regions, the nucleus accumbens and the orbital frontal cortex, as looking at and interacting with a human infant.
So the ancient brain mechanism responsible for triggering parental bonding and investment, it doesn't distinguish between a child and a dog.
Not effectively, no. Pet ownership is an efficient supernormal stimulus because it satisfies these primal urges for nurturing, companionship, and low-risk social connection. It delivers an emotional reward and a predictable dopamine hit. The dog is always happy to see you. It responds immediately to feeding with very low long-term risk and no genetic trade-off.
So it diminishes the evolutionary pressure to do the real thing.
Fundamentally, the dog is the low-cost replacement for the nurturing urge.
And when we look at digital superstimuli, the replacement is for the urge for mastery and purpose.
Absolutely. The digital realm is a factory of manufactured dopamine hits that substitute for real mastery. Video games, for example, are highly effective at this. They employ these compulsion loops that offer immediate, achievable goals. Think about gaming. They often establish a baseline of power for the player, a sense of achievement, only to strip it away, forcing the player to engage in grinding or repetitive low-value activity just to restore that baseline. This is the activity component of the dopamine loop perfected.
And loot boxes.
Loot boxes are the variable rate reinforcement at its most cynical. Random rewards coupled with intense sensory inputs, bright lights, special sounds, all designed to heighten the anticipation and release. It substitutes the difficult long-term mastery of a career or raising a competitive human being with easily attainable, fleeting digital mastery.
And this substitution extends even to the mechanisms that trigger sexual excitement and reproductive activity, the very act that initiates the whole process.
That's right. Internet pornography is widely cited as a powerful novel cue that replaces actual partners as input to the sexual mechanisms. It's highly stimulating, it recruits the natural reward system, and it can potentially activate the mechanism at higher, more predictable levels than our ancestors typically encountered in real-world mating scenarios. The input is intense, the response is quick, but the output is zero reproductive effort. The brain is just thoroughly hijacked, achieving primal satisfaction without incurring the evolutionary cost.
So the internal wiring has been rerouted by easy dopamine. Now let's return to the external pressure Mark cited, that astronomical rational cost of $318,000 per child. We established this is not just about money, it's about status competition, which forces the abort mission on having multiple children.
This is a crucial pivot point in the discussion. We have to start by defining the difference between wealth and social status. Wealth is purely material. Your bank account, your property, your income, it's absolute. Status, conversely, is a positional good.
A positional good. What does that mean?
It means it's a person's ordinal position or relative rank within their locally relevant social community. Its value is entirely dependent on how much of it is possessed by others.
So it's not about being rich. It's about being richer than your neighbor.
Exactly. If everyone in your community drives a luxury car, driving a luxury car no longer confers status. If everyone is rich, being rich no longer makes you special. Status seeking is a basic, universal human motivation that affects reproductive outcomes in almost every society studied. We are fundamentally wired to compete for rank.
And how has status changed?
Historically, status involved visible elements of dominance, like strength, and prestige, like respect or demonstrated skill. In modern, complex societies, status inputs are abstract. Your university degree, your profession, the zip code of your home, and critically, the investment you make in your children's competitive future.
And this is where the evolutionary playbook completely flips. Historically, higher wealth or status often meant higher fertility, especially for men who could support multiple offspring.
That's the pre-demographic transition norm. But during the demographic transition, this relationship inverted. In modern populations, we see the steepest reductions in fertility among people who have the highest socioeconomic status.
And that inversion is driven by the quantity-quality trade-off.
Yes.
Let's talk about that trade-off in detail. Why can't high-status people simply have many children and invest heavily in them? Why is it one or the other?
The constraint is the type of resource required for competitive success today. Under specific modern ecological conditions, specifically conditions featuring easily heritable wealth, competitive modern markets, and the indispensable role of education parental investment in quality, so status, skills, education. It trades off steeply with the quantity of children. The cost isn't just financial, it's time, focus, and personal embodied capital.
Embodied capital.
Yeah. To ensure their children are socially competitive, parents feel they must invest high levels of embodied capital, meaning advanced skills, robust health, emotional stability, and, most importantly, competitive educational attainment. The required investment is massive because the environment demands highly skilled individuals just to maintain rank.
This is the educational arms race Mark was talking about. You don't just need to pay for college. You need the private tutors, the specialized sports, the trips abroad, the summer programs, all to signal that your child is an elite investment.
Precisely. These massive status signals drive the trade-off. Think of the investment required to secure an Ivy League education, or even the subtle status signals of a gold-plated resume. These are investments that signal the parent's commitment and the child's potential rank. If Mark and Sarah calculate that they need to spend $300,000 in direct costs, plus thousands of hours of monitoring and parental time on one child just to ensure that child competes successfully against their neighbor's children, they are rationally forced to conclude that they cannot afford 3 children.
Wait, let me play devil's advocate for a moment, as a listener might be thinking this. If Mark and Sarah are so wealthy, why can't they just hire people to manage the competition? Why does the system demand their personal investment, their embodied capital, rather than just their money?
That is a fundamental point. While wealth allows you to outsource things like cleaning or even primary care, the status-generating inputs are often non-tradable or non-substitutable. Academic success, for instance, requires intensive, focused, emotionally supportive parenting, what's often called intensive parenting. A tutor can teach math, but the long-term cognitive and emotional capital required for truly high achievement. That often depends on parental monitoring, stress management, and emotional investment.
So you can't just buy your kid a perfect childhood?
Not for status purposes, no. When status competition intensifies, the cost of that unsubstitutable parental time and effort skyrockets, reinforcing the quality over quantity choice, even among the very rich.
That locks them in. The theoretical model you referenced looked specifically at how inequality and the intensity of competition amplify this effect. What did that model show?
Well, the models were designed to isolate the variables causing fertility decline. And they suggested that economic productivity and mortality risk alone are just insufficient to explain the full extent of the decline.
So there was a missing piece.
The missing piece is the role of status competition. The model hypothesized that optimal parental investment, and consequently fertility, would change dynamically based on the specific socio-ecological conditions. And the model predicted that optimal fertility decreases substantially when faced with 2 modern conditions. First, greater inequality in the inputs necessary for status.
Meaning the rewards for being at the top are huge, and the penalties for being at the bottom are severe.
Exactly. And second, greater intensity of status competition, meaning failure to gain rank, is highly punitive.
So if I'm a parent, I look at a highly unequal society and I realize my children need every single competitive edge possible to avoid falling into a low-status, low-return bracket.
Precisely. The returns for high-status investments become steeper and more critical in an unequal society. The model showed that as inequality increases, optimal fertility declines significantly. Parents recognized they must front-load a disproportionate amount of resources into one or two children because the consequences of having a low-status child in a highly unequal world are just. They are severe.
So high inequality plus high competition is the recipe for low fertility.
It's the perfect storm. When you combine that high inequality with high competition, meaning the payoff for achieving a high social rank is maximized, the system generates the highest levels of social capital investment and, inevitably, the lowest fertility rates. Parents are acting as fitness maximizing agents, but they are maximizing the quality of one child's future status, which comes at the direct expense of quantity. This is the evolutionary abort mission on large families.
So this whole analysis, the dual forces, the internal biological hijack and the external status arms race, it leads us to the elephant in the room, public policy. Governments are desperate to reverse these trends. They're offering grants, subsidies, tax breaks. But if the problem is rooted in these deep, ancient hijack mechanisms, traditional policies designed to reduce economic cost seem destined to fail.
They are destined to meet limited success because they address the surface economic cost without recognizing the fundamental drivers of human motivation. The lead fertility we see in affluent societies is inherently maladaptive. It runs contrary to the material conditions of radical wealth and health, which should theoretically allow for larger, healthier families. This paradox makes simple economic policy extremely difficult.
Why do policies often fail when they ignore these evolved mechanisms?
Because evolutionary research shows humans operate on deep, fundamental tendencies. Self-interest, an intense concern over relative social status, social imitation, and future discounting. If a policy ignores these motivations, it either meets resistance or it produces an unintended side effect. For instance, people may recognize the long-term collective benefit of high fertility, but they discount that future benefit in favor of the immediate relative benefit of maximizing their own status or consumption.
Okay, so let's consider what happens if a government tries to solve the $300,000 problem by making childcare free or highly subsidized, reducing the direct economic cost. Does that lead to more babies?
Not necessarily, no, because of the status feedback loop. If you reduce the direct economic cost of children, parents don't necessarily decide to have more children. They often reallocate that saved money and time into other forms of status investment designed to enhance the competitive rank of the one or two children they plan to have anyway.
The arms race continues.
The high investment, low fertility trade-off just perpetuates itself.
So the subsidy doesn't increase quantity. It merely shifts the form of quality investment. If daycare is free, Mark and Sarah don't necessarily have a second child. They save $23,000 a year on specialized coding tutors, or international travel for cultural capital, or private health insurance to ensure competitive perfection for their one child.
That is the policy constraint in action. The investment burden shifts from direct economic costs to highly localized, personalized status signaling. It might shift from tuition to, say, funding their child's niche artistic pursuits or ensuring they have bespoke nutritional input that signals hyper-vigilant parenting. The competition simply moves to a different, perhaps more abstract battleground.
We have empirical evidence that high inequality exacerbates this status competition effect on fertility, right?
We do. The data clearly indicates that the fertility differential, so the gap between the lowest fertility groups, often the most educated and affluent, and the higher fertility groups, often the less educated, is significantly greater in countries with high levels of social and economic inequality.
Which suggests?
It suggests that when society is highly unequal, the stakes of the status competition are raised so high that educated, status-conscious parents feel compelled to adopt an even more extreme maximal investment strategy per child. The risk of their child failing to achieve high status in an unequal society is just too punitive, reinforcing the choice to have fewer children but invest disproportionately more in each.
The status game becomes zero-sum. And the policy often becomes a new tool in the game. It sounds like the intervention itself becomes part of the arms race.
It creates a really challenging constraint for policy. For instance, increasing the accessibility of education may sound like a good solution, but if you don't reduce the status premium associated with the highest levels of education, like getting into a top-tier university, you merely intensify the arms race for that elite position.
You've made the competition more universal, but the outcome, the incentive to maximally invest remains.
Exactly.
So policy needs to not just reduce costs, but somehow reduce the return on intensive parental investment. I mean, how do you even do that without fundamentally changing the modern economy?
That is the existential dilemma. One proposed pathway would be to align policy with evolved tendencies rather than opposing them. For example, policies could be designed to shift the perceived status associated with large families.
Make having 3 kids the new status symbol?
Something like that. It might mean making the burden of care visible and socially praiseworthy, perhaps by granting status or prestige not to the most intensely educated child, but to the family unit that successfully manages multiple children in a high-complexity world.
That's a fascinating idea.
Another approach is tackling the superstimulus hijack. If the brain is being lured away by predictable, low-cost digital rewards, policymakers need to ask whether the cost-benefit ratio of having children can be made more immediately and predictably rewarding, or if the alternatives can be made less appealing. And that is incredibly difficult in liberal societies.
It seems like the entire phenomenon is a form of evolutionary runaway consumerism. The cultural artifacts, Barnaby, the video game mastery, the Ivy League entrance, have become the beneficiaries of our psychological biases, not our biological lineage.
That's the tragic conclusion. The psychological machinery evolved under conditions of scarcity and high mortality. It was designed to maximize genetic fitness by having children. But when confronted with conditions of extreme abundance, complexity, and digital superstimuli, that machinery short-circuits. It finds much easier, cheaper, and faster ways to achieve the feelings of mastery, connection, and nurturing that it craves.
This is a perfect storm where the external social environment, characterized by overwhelming costs and high-stakes status competition, demands few, highly invested offspring.
And simultaneously, the internal biological environment driven by superstimuli and dopamine loops provides easy, non-reproductive satisfaction for those same deep-seated needs.
So Mark and Sarah, the wealthy couple at the beginning of this deep dive, they're not simply victims of high daycare costs, nor are they selfish. They are rational actors responding to an ancient psychological mechanism that has been fundamentally short-circuited by modernity. They are trapped in an unwinnable, escalating evolutionary arms race for status, which dictates having 0 or 1 child. And to alleviate the deep, primal urge for connection and nurturing that remains, that energy is efficiently and inexpensively routed right to Barnaby, the perfect supernormal stimulus. They are maximizing their perceived fitness returns, but in a world that is now biologically rigged against their own reproduction.